There's a fascinating group of people on social media who exist in the shadows. They're there, scrolling through feeds, watching stories, reading posts, observing everything. But they never contribute. They don't post photos. They don't share their thoughts. They don't comment or react. They're the silent observers, the digital ghosts who consume content without ever creating it. And in a culture that celebrates self-expression and visibility, these people seem almost mysterious. Who are they? What are they thinking? Why do they watch everything but never participate? Are they shy, insecure, judgmental? Or is there something deeper, something more psychologically complex happening beneath their silence? Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists in history, spent his life exploring the hidden dimensions of human behavior. And although he never lived to see social media, his theories offer profound insights into why some people choose to observe rather than participate. Understanding these silent watchers requires understanding Jung's concepts of introversion, the observer archetype, psychological boundaries, and the relationship between consciousness and participation. So let's explore the truth about people who watch everything but never post, and what their silence reveals about human psychology. The first thing to understand is that observing without participating isn't passivity. It's a choice, and often a very conscious one. Jung distinguished between two fundamental orientations of psychic energy: extroversion and introversion. Extroverts direct their energy outward, toward people, activities, and external engagement. They're energized by interaction, by expressing themselves, by being part of the action. Introverts, on the other hand, direct their energy inward. They're energized by solitude, reflection, and internal processing. They observe the world carefully before engaging with it, if they choose to engage at all. People who watch everything but never post are often operating from this introverted orientation. They're not avoiding participation out of fear. They're choosing observation because it aligns with how they naturally process information and energy. For them, scrolling through social media isn't about finding opportunities to share their own lives. It's about understanding others, gathering information, staying connected in a way that doesn't drain them. Jung would say these individuals are honoring their psychological type. They're not forcing themselves to behave like extroverts simply because that's what social media rewards. They're remaining true to their nature, even if it makes them invisible to others. This alignment with their authentic orientation is actually a sign of psychological health, not dysfunction. There's also something profound happening with what Jung called the observer archetype. In Jungian psychology, archetypes are universal patterns of behavior and personality that appear across cultures and throughout history. The observer, sometimes called the witness or the sage, is one of these archetypal patterns. People operating from this archetype are naturally inclined to watch, to study, to understand before acting. They value knowledge over action, insight over expression, understanding over performance. They're not content creators, they're meaning makers. They watch the drama of human life unfold on social media, and they're analyzing it, learning from it, understanding patterns and behaviors. For these individuals, social media is less a platform for self-expression and more a window into human nature. They're fascinated by what people choose to share, by the masks people wear, by the collective patterns that emerge. They're psychological anthropologists, studying the digital tribe from a distance. Jung himself was very much an observer. He spent years analyzing dreams, studying myths, exploring the human psyche, often in solitude. He understood that some people are called to watch, to witness, to understand, rather than to perform. And he valued this role highly, believing that observers often see truths that participants miss. People who watch everything but never post are carrying on this tradition. They're the quiet witnesses of the digital age, gathering insights that escape those too busy performing to truly see. But there's another layer to this behavior that Jung would find fascinating: the relationship between observation and projection. Jung discovered that much of what we see in others is actually a reflection of our own unconscious. When you observe someone's behavior, you're not just seeing them objectively. You're also projecting your own experiences, fears, desires, and judgments onto them. This process, called projection, happens automatically and unconsciously. People who watch social media without posting are, in a sense, engaging in a massive projection exercise. Every post they see, every photo they scroll past, every story they watch activates something within them. They might feel envy at someone's success, judgment at someone's choices, curiosity about someone's lifestyle, or connection with someone's struggle. And all of these reactions are revealing something about their own psyche, their own shadows, their own unconscious content. The interesting thing is, many silent observers are actually quite self-aware about this process. They're not just mindlessly consuming content. They're noticing their reactions, asking themselves why certain posts trigger certain emotions, using social media as a mirror for self-understanding. This is what Jung called active imagination, engaging with external material as a way to explore your internal world. For these individuals, watching social media becomes a form of psychological work. They're not participating in the surface-level game of likes and comments. They're using the platform as a tool for self-discovery. This is a sophisticated, highly conscious way of engaging with social media, even if it looks like passive consumption from the outside. There's also something crucial happening with boundaries. Jung believed that healthy individuals have clear psychological boundaries. They know where they end and others begin. They understand what's theirs to carry and what belongs to someone else. Social media, by its nature, blurs these boundaries. When you post, you're inviting others into your psychic space. You're opening yourself to their opinions, their judgments, their projections, and you're also risking absorbing their energy, their expectations, their influence. People who watch but never post have recognized this boundary issue, and they've chosen to protect themselves. By remaining observers, they maintain clear boundaries. They can engage with others' content without allowing others to engage with theirs. They can stay informed without becoming vulnerable. They can participate in the collective digital experience without losing their sense of self. This boundary maintenance is particularly important for what Jung called sensitive individuals. People whose psychic boundaries are naturally more porous, who absorb others' emotions and energy more easily. For these people, posting on social media can feel overwhelming. The judgment, the comparison, the emotional reactions of others can penetrate too deeply, creating distress. By choosing to observe rather than participate, they're protecting their psychological integrity. They're engaging with social media in a way that doesn't compromise their emotional well-being. This isn't weakness or avoidance, it's wisdom. The wisdom to know your own limits and honor them. Another profound aspect of why people watch everything but never post relates to Jung's concept of the persona and the fear of persona inflation. The persona, as we've discussed, is the mask we wear in public, the version of ourselves we present to navigate social expectations. On social media, the persona becomes highly visible and carefully constructed. Every post is a piece of the persona puzzle, building an image of who you want others to think you are. But Jung warned about what happens when the persona becomes too important. When you start identifying with the mask rather than remembering it's just a mask. This is called persona inflation, and it's psychologically dangerous. When your sense of self becomes dependent on your public image, you lose touch with your authentic core. You start living for applause rather than truth. You become the performance rather than the performer. People who watch but never post have often recognized this danger intuitively. They understand that the moment they start posting, they'll be creating a persona that will need to be maintained. Every subsequent post will need to align with the image they've established. They'll need to worry about consistency, about what others expect, about managing their digital identity, and many of them simply don't want that burden. They'd rather remain undefined, free from the constraints of a curated image. By staying silent, they avoid persona inflation altogether. They don't have a digital persona to maintain, which means they remain more connected to their authentic self. They can change, evolve, and explore different aspects of themselves without needing to explain or justify these shifts to an audience. This freedom from persona maintenance is liberating. It allows them to be fluid, complex, and contradictory in ways that public figures can't afford to be. There's also something significant happening with what Jung called the introvert's need for internal processing before external expression. Jung observed that introverts need time to process experiences internally before they're ready to share them externally. Unlike extroverts, who think out loud and process through conversation, introverts need solitude and reflection to understand what they think and feel. For these individuals, the speed of social media is incompatible with their natural rhythm. By the time they've processed an experience enough to feel comfortable sharing it, the moment has passed. The vacation is over, the event is old news, the feeling has evolved into something else, so they simply don't post. Not because they don't have anything to share, but because their internal timeline doesn't match social media's demand for immediate documentation. This temporal mismatch is important to understand. People who watch but never post aren't necessarily withholding. They're operating on a different timescale, one that prioritizes depth over speed, understanding over immediacy. Jung would see this as honoring their psychological type, rather than forcing themselves into an incompatible mode of expression. There's also a fascinating connection to what Jung called the shadow and projection. Remember, the shadow represents the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. And projection is the unconscious process of seeing our own shadow qualities in others. People who spend time watching social media without posting are constantly engaging with projections. They see others living the lives they secretly want, expressing the confidence they wish they had, or making the mistakes they're afraid of making. Every strong reaction they have to someone's post is likely revealing something about their own shadow. The interesting thing is, many silent observers are actually working with these projections consciously. They're noticing when they feel jealous, judgmental, inspired, or triggered, and they're asking themselves what that reveals about their own unconscious material. This is sophisticated psychological work. Instead of unconsciously acting out their shadow through negative comments or competitive posting, they're using observation as a tool for self-understanding. They're watching the external drama of social media to illuminate their internal drama. This is what Jung meant by making the unconscious conscious, using external experiences to reveal internal truths. And it's a practice that requires observation rather than participation. Let's also consider the role of what Jung called psychic energy conservation. Jung believed that we each have a finite amount of psychic energy available each day, and how we spend that energy determines the quality of our psychological life. Every interaction, every decision, every creative act requires energy, and social media is particularly energy-intensive. Not just the posting itself, but the entire emotional cycle that follows, monitoring reactions, managing responses, dealing with the emotional impact of how your post is received. People who watch but never post have often made a conscious calculation about energy expenditure. They've realized that posting drains more energy than it provides. The anxiety of crafting the perfect caption, the vulnerability of sharing, the emotional labor of managing others' reactions. It all costs too much, so they choose to conserve their energy for other things, for their work, their relationships, their creative projects, their internal development. This isn't laziness, it's strategic resource management. They're asking themselves, where does my energy create the most value? And they've concluded that it's not on social media. By watching without posting, they stay informed and connected without the energy drain of performance. Jung also understood something crucial about the relationship between observation and power. There's a certain power in remaining unknown while knowing others. When you watch social media without posting, you're gathering information about people, their values, their struggles, their daily lives, while revealing nothing about yourself. This creates an asymmetry of knowledge that some people find empowering. They understand others without being understood themselves. They can observe patterns and behaviors without being subject to others' observations. This isn't necessarily manipulative or sinister. For many people, it's simply comfortable. They don't like being known too well, being categorized, being reduced to a set of posts and images. By remaining invisible, they maintain their complexity, their mystery, their freedom from others' definitions. Jung spoke about the importance of maintaining some unknowability, some aspect of yourself that remains hidden even from those close to you. He believed this mystery was essential for psychological depth, that being too transparent, too known, could actually flatten your personality. People who watch but never post are preserving this mystery. They're maintaining depth in an age of surface, complexity in an era of simplification. And there's wisdom in that choice. Finally, let's consider the audience perspective. People who watch everything are also, in a sense, the true audience that content creators crave. They're consuming content, absorbing messages, being influenced by what they see, even if they never acknowledge it through likes or comments. They're the silent majority, the invisible consumer base that makes social media viable. And their silence doesn't mean they're unaffected. They're learning, forming opinions, being shaped by what they observe, just without leaving traces of their presence. There's a deeper truth about people who watch everything, but never post, that connects to Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious and archetypal possession. Jung believed that when large groups of people come together, especially when they're emotionally charged, archetypal forces can take over. Social media amplifies this phenomenon dramatically. Trends sweep through platforms like psychological contagions. Entire communities can become possessed by archetypal patterns: the hero, the victim, the redeemer, the rebel, without individuals even realizing they've lost their autonomy. People who watch but never post are often acutely aware of this danger. They see how easily others get swept up in collective emotions, how quickly nuance disappears, how powerfully archetypal forces operate in digital spaces, and they've made a conscious decision not to participate in that dynamic. By remaining observers, they maintain psychological distance from collective possession. They can watch the archetypal dramas unfold without being pulled into them. They can observe the mob mentality without joining the mob. This isn't superiority or judgment. It's self-protection based on deep psychological awareness. Jung warned that when you participate in collective movements without consciousness, you risk losing your individual identity to archetypal forces larger than yourself. These silent watchers have heeded that warning. They're protecting their individuality by refusing to be absorbed into the collective emotional currents that dominate social media. There's also something crucial happening with what modern psychology would call the dopamine trap. Social media platforms are engineered to trigger dopamine release, creating addictive cycles similar to gambling or substance use. Every like, every comment, every notification provides a small hit of pleasure that keeps you coming back for more. But people who watch without posting have often recognized this manipulation and chosen to opt out of the reward cycle. They don't post because they understand that posting would make them vulnerable to this dopamine-driven feedback loop. They'd start craving validation, monitoring their metrics, feeling anxious when engagement drops. By never entering the game, they avoid the addiction altogether. Jung would recognize this as consciousness protecting the psyche from exploitation. When you understand the mechanisms trying to control you, you can resist them. These individuals have seen through the gamification of human connection and refuse to play. This requires tremendous psychological strength in a culture that constantly rewards participation with pleasure hits. Another profound aspect relates to what Jung called the tension between persona and self. The persona is your social mask, necessary for navigating society, but the self with a capital S is your deepest, truest essence. Jung believed that psychological health requires keeping these distinct, knowing when you're wearing the mask and when you're being authentic. Social media creates a dangerous conflation of persona and self. The carefully curated online identity starts to feel like your real identity. You begin to believe you are the mask, forgetting there's a deeper, more complex person underneath. People who watch but never post have avoided this conflation. Because they haven't created an online persona, they remain more connected to their authentic self. They haven't had to construct a consistent public image, which means they're freer to be inconsistent, complex, and contradictory in their private reality. This preservation of the distinction between persona and self is psychologically vital. It allows them to know themselves more honestly, without the distortion that comes from identifying with a public image. Jung also understood something about what he called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our psychological type that remains largely unconscious. For many people who watch but don't post, their inferior function might be extroverted expression, the ability to spontaneously share themselves with others. This isn't a flaw, it's simply how their psyche is structured. Their strength lies elsewhere, in observation, in reflection, in internal processing. Social media, which heavily rewards extroverted expression, simply doesn't play to their strengths. And rather than forcing themselves to develop an inferior function just to fit in, they've honored their natural gifts. They've chosen to excel at what they do well, watching, understanding, synthesizing, rather than struggling to perform in ways that don't suit their nature. Jung would applaud this self-acceptance. He believed that trying to develop your inferior function at the expense of your superior functions was psychologically damaging. Better to accept your natural orientation and work within it. There's also a fascinating connection to what Jung observed about the modern loss of ritual and meaning. In traditional societies, people had clear roles, rituals, and collective practices that provided psychological containment and meaning. Modern society has largely lost these structures, and social media has emerged as a kind of pseudo-ritual space where people seek meaning, connection, and identity. But people who watch without posting have often recognized that social media doesn't actually fulfill these deeper needs. The rituals are empty, the connections are shallow, the meaning is manufactured. So they observe the collective attempting to fill this spiritual void with digital activity. But they don't participate because they understand it won't satisfy what they're truly seeking. Many of these individuals have found genuine sources of meaning elsewhere, in creative work, in nature, in spiritual practice, in deep relationships, in service to others. They don't need social media to provide meaning because they've cultivated it authentically in their lives. This is what Jung meant by individuation, finding your own unique path to wholeness rather than following the collective script. Let's also consider the role of what Jung called active imagination. The practice of engaging with unconscious material through creative dialogue, People who watch social media are, in a sense, engaging in a form of active imagination. They're observing the symbolic material that others post, the images, stories, and expressions, and they're using it to stimulate their own inner dialogue. They might see someone's vacation photo, and it triggers thoughts about their own relationship to adventure, work, freedom. They might see someone's political post, and it activates their own shadow material around power, justice, or belonging. This internal dialogue is rich and valuable, even though it produces no external output. They're using social media as a catalyst for inner work, rather than as a platform for outer performance. This is a deeply Jungian way of engaging with the world, using external stimuli to illuminate internal landscapes. Finally, there's something to be said about the wisdom of waiting. Jung understood that not everything needs to be expressed immediately, that some things need to incubate in the unconscious before they're ready to emerge. People who watch but never post are often practicing this patience. They're taking in information, experiences and perspectives, allowing them to settle into their psyche, to be processed and integrated over time. Perhaps the most profound truth about people who watch everything but never post is that they represent a specific psychological type that Jung would have deeply understood. In his theory of psychological types, Jung identified different ways people orient themselves to the world based on their dominant cognitive functions. Introverted thinking types, for example, are primarily concerned with understanding systems and ideas internally. Introverted feeling types process values and emotions deeply but privately. These types naturally prefer observation and internal processing over external expression. Social media, by contrast, is designed primarily for extroverted types, those who think and feel through external engagement, who need to express themselves outwardly to process internally. When introverted types try to use social media in the way it's designed, it feels unnatural, exhausting, even violating. People who watch but never post are often introverted types who've recognized this mismatch and chosen to use the platform in a way that aligns with their natural orientation, consuming and processing internally rather than creating and sharing externally. This isn't dysfunction, it's type-appropriate behavior. Jung believed that psychological health comes from honoring your natural type rather than forcing yourself to be something you're not. These silent watchers are doing exactly that. There's also something profound happening with what modern research calls digital individuation. Jung's concept of individuation, becoming your whole, authentic self, takes on new dimensions in the digital age. Some researchers argue that social media can facilitate individuation by providing access to diverse perspectives, communities, and expressions that help you discover who you are. But others argue that social media prevents individuation by pulling you into collective conformity and persona inflation. People who watch but never post seem to have found a middle path. They're using social media as a window into human diversity, without allowing it to shape their identity. They're gathering information that supports their individuation process, seeing different ways of being, understanding various perspectives without getting caught in the performance trap that prevents genuine self-discovery. This selective engagement shows psychological sophistication. They're using the tool in a way that serves their development rather than letting the tool use them. Jung also understood something crucial about what he called the archetypal narrative. Throughout history, humans have told stories that follow archetypal patterns: the hero's journey, the wise sage, the transformative descent. Social media has become a space where people perform these archetypal narratives publicly, everyone positioning themselves as the hero of their own story. People who watch but never post are often aware of these archetypal performances. They see others enacting the creator archetype through their artistic posts, the explorer through their travel content, the sage through their educational material, the lover through their relationship displays. And they're studying these performances, learning from them, understanding the archetypal patterns that drive human behavior, without feeling compelled to perform their own archetypal identity publicly. This observational stance gives them unique insight into the collective psyche. They're like anthropologists studying the digital tribe, understanding the patterns and symbols that others enact unconsciously. There's also something significant about what Jung called the compensatory function of the unconscious. Jung observed that the unconscious often compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes. If you're too extroverted consciously, your unconscious will produce introverted dreams and fantasies to balance you. If you're too focused on thinking, your unconscious will stir up feelings to compensate. People who watch social media without posting might be engaging in a form of conscious compensation. They see the extreme extroversion, the constant performance, the relentless positivity of social media, and they consciously compensate by being introverted, private, and honest about the full spectrum of human experience. This creates internal balance. They don't need to post because they're not living one-sidedly. They're already integrated, already whole, already balanced between inner and outer, private and public, observation and participation. Jung would see this as a sign of psychological maturity. Let's also address the spiritual dimension of watching without posting. Jung believed that much of what appears as psychological suffering is actually spiritual crisis, the soul seeking meaning, wholeness, connection with something greater than the ego. Social media promises to fulfill these spiritual needs through connection, community, and meaning. But for many people, it fails to deliver authentic spiritual satisfaction. People who watch but never post have often recognized this spiritual bankruptcy. They see others seeking spiritual fulfillment through digital performance and validation, but they understand it's a false substitute for genuine spiritual experience. So they observe the collective spiritual seeking without participating in its digital manifestation. Many of these individuals have found authentic spiritual practices outside social media: meditation, prayer, nature immersion, creative work, service to others, things that genuinely nourish the soul rather than just stimulating the ego. This spiritual discernment is rare and valuable. It shows they understand the difference between what genuinely feeds the soul and what merely distracts from its hunger. Finally, there's something to be said about the truth that watching without posting is itself a form of participation. These individuals aren't absent from the digital collective. They're present in a different way, as witnesses, as observers, as the consciousness that watches without being consumed. In Jungian terms, they're like the self observing the ego's drama, present but not identified, engaged but not possessed. They're the audience that gives meaning to the performance, the consciousness that reflects on what's happening rather than just reacting to it. This observational presence is actually essential for the collective. Without watchers, without witnesses, without people who maintain some distance and perspective, the collective would spiral further into unconsciousness. These silent observers are holding consciousness for the rest of us, maintaining some degree of perspective and awareness in a space that often lacks both. Carl Jung spent his life studying the depths of human psychology, and he understood that not everyone needs to express themselves outwardly to be psychologically healthy. In fact, for many people, the healthiest stance is observation, internal processing, and selective engagement. People who watch everything but never post aren't broken, shy, or missing out. They're operating from a different psychological orientation, one that values inner depth over outer display, understanding over expression, presence over performance. They're using social media in a way that serves their natural type and supports their individuation, rather than forcing themselves into behaviors that don't fit who they are. They're maintaining psychological boundaries, conserving psychic energy, avoiding persona inflation, and protecting themselves from collective possession. They're watching the archetypal dramas of the digital age while maintaining enough distance to learn from them without being consumed by them. And in doing so, they're demonstrating a form of psychological wisdom that's increasingly rare. The wisdom to know yourself well enough to honor your own nature, even when it goes against the cultural current. Jung would recognize these individuals not as failures to participate, but as successful individuators who found their own authentic way of being in the digital world.